In the spring of 399 BC, in a small stone cell in Athens, an old man waited calmly for a cup of poison. He was not a murderer. He was not a traitor. He was, by his own account, simply a man who asked too many questions. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the city that gave the world theater, philosophy, and the jury trial, had just sentenced its most famous thinker to death. 501 of his fellow citizens had voted, and a narrow majority chose to kill him. So how did it come to this? How did the man later called the father of Western philosophy end up condemned by his own city on charges of corrupting its young people and disrespecting its gods? The answer is stranger and more human than most people realize. This is the story of Socrates, the barefoot philosopher who never wrote a single word, who claimed to know nothing at all, and whose death became one of the most consequential events in the history of ideas. Stay with us, because the real story is not what you think. Was it really about religion? About corrupting teenagers? Or was Socrates paying, years late, for the company he used to keep? Historians still argue about the true motive behind his death sentence. Almost everyone agrees the official charges were only ever part of the real story. The Gadfly of Athens. Socrates was born around 470 BC, the son of a stonemason and a midwife in a city just beginning its golden age. He trained briefly in his father's trade, carving stone, but something about shaping rock never satisfied him the way shaping an argument did. Friends and rivals alike described him the same way. Short, stocky, with a flat nose and bulging eyes that made him, by his own joking admission, no beauty. He walked the streets of Athens barefoot in every season, seemingly immune to heat, cold, and hunger alike. But what truly set him apart was not his appearance. It was his habit of stopping people in the street, in the marketplace, at the gymnasium, and asking them simple-sounding questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? Questions everyone assumed they already knew the answer to. He rarely answered his own questions. Instead, through patient, relentless follow-up questions, he would guide the person toward exposing the gaps and contradictions in their own thinking. Today we call this the Socratic method. In ancient Athens, people simply called it humiliating, especially if you were the one being questioned. Young Athenians loved it. Wealthy sons of prominent families began following him around the city, imitating his method, cross-examining their own fathers and teachers at dinner. Older, powerful men loved it far less. Being publicly out-argued by a poor, barefoot stonemason's son was not easy to forgive. Socrates never charged a fee for his conversations, unlike the professional traveling teachers of his day, known as the sophists, who taught rhetoric for money. He insisted he had no wisdom to sell. What he had, he said, was only awareness of his own ignorance. He also spoke often of what he called his daimonion, a private inner voice or sign that he said had visited him since childhood. It never told him what to do. It only ever warned him, at key moments, when he was about to make a mistake. A typical conversation might start with something as simple as asking a respected shoemaker to define exactly what made a shoe well made. By the end, the shoemaker often realized he could explain his craft, but not the deeper principle behind it. Socrates rarely let anyone leave a conversation quite as certain as they arrived. Friends also remembered his legendary self-control. At long Athenian drinking parties, he was famous for outlasting everyone at the table, drinking as much as anyone in the room, yet somehow never once appearing drunk. It became one more thing that made him seem, to admirers and critics alike, slightly unlike everyone else. Socrates had a name for his own method, borrowed from his mother's profession. She had worked as a midwife, and he liked to say that he practiced a kind of midwifery of the mind, not implanting ideas in people, but patiently helping them deliver the ideas they already carried inside themselves. The Oracle and the Examined Life. The strangeness of his mission traces back to one impulsive friend, a man named Chaerephon, known for his excitable temperament, once traveled to the Oracle of Delphi, the most sacred site in the Greek world, and asked the priestess a bold question. Was there anyone in Athens wiser than Socrates? The answer that came back stunned him. No one, the oracle said, was wiser than Socrates. When Chaerephon brought the news home to Athens, Socrates did not celebrate it. He was baffled. He knew he had no special wisdom to speak of, so he decided to test the god. He set out across Athens, questioning politicians, poets, and skilled craftsmen, people widely admired for their wisdom, to find someone who truly knew more than he did. Over and over, he found the same pattern. People who were confident experts in one narrow skill assumed that confidence extended to everything else in life. Eventually, Socrates arrived at an unsettling conclusion. He was wiser, in one narrow sense, only because he alone seemed to understand how little he actually knew. Everyone else mistook their limited expertise for total wisdom. He had accidentally proven the oracle right and made a great many enemies doing it. Ancient tradition held that the temple at Delphi bore an inscription reading simply, "Know thyself." For Socrates, that phrase became something like a mission statement. He came to believe that a life spent never examining one's own beliefs was barely worth living at all. But philosophy, it turns out, makes for very poor public relations. Every politician he embarrassed, every celebrated poet he showed couldn't actually explain his own poems, every craftsman whose son stopped respecting him walked away with a grudge. Socrates was collecting admirers among the young and enemies among the powerful in roughly equal measure. When Socrates turned his questions toward Athens' most celebrated poets, the results were often the same. A poet could recite his own verses beautifully, and audiences could be moved to tears by them. Yet, when asked to explain exactly what the poem meant, many poets simply could not do it. It left him with an uncomfortable realization. The city's most admired voices, its politicians, poets, and craftsmen, were treated as though their narrow expertise made them wise about everything. Socrates began to suspect that this confusion, mistaking one kind of knowledge for total wisdom, was the real root of most bad decisions in public life. It's worth noting, Socrates was not, in any obvious sense, irreligious. He performed the customary sacrifices, honored the traditional festivals, and spoke constantly of divine guidance in his own life. The charge of impiety was never really about disbelief. It was about a private, unfamiliar kind of faith that made other Athenians deeply uneasy. Socrates often reminded his young followers that questioning authority was not the same as disrespecting the city. He genuinely loved Athens, defended it in war, and obeyed its laws his entire life. He simply believed a city was healthier when its citizens thought carefully instead of simply repeating what they had always been told. War and dangerous students. Socrates was not only a talker. For much of his life, Athens was locked in the brutal Peloponnesian War against Sparta, and Socrates served as a citizen soldier, a hoplite, in some of its harshest campaigns. At the siege of a northern city called Potidæa, he reportedly stood watch barefoot through a freezing winter that left other soldiers wrapped in furs. During that same campaign, a brilliant magnetic young nobleman named Alcibiades fought at his side and was wounded. According to later accounts, it was Socrates, not the man's own bodyguards, who stood over him and fought off the enemy, saving his life. The two would remain entangled for the rest of their lives. Years later, at the disastrous Battle of Delium, the Athenian army broke and fled. Amid the panic, witnesses later recalled one soldier who did not run in terror, but retreated calmly, watching every direction, ready to fight if the enemy closed in. That composure under fire became part of his legend. Alcibiades, meanwhile, became one of the most talked about men in Athens. Brilliant, reckless, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. He talked the city into a massive, ambitious invasion of Sicily. It ended in catastrophe, with tens of thousands of Athenian soldiers dead or enslaved, and Athens' fortunes in the war never recovered. Facing prosecution back home over a religious scandal, Alcibiades fled to Athens' enemy Sparta and later to Persia, switching sides more than once to survive. He had once been Socrates' most famous student. Now his name had become a symbol of Athenian betrayal and disaster. Then came an even darker chapter. When Sparta finally defeated Athens in 404 BC, it installed a brutal ruling council known to history as the 30 Tyrants. Their leader, a cold and calculating aristocrat named Crito, had also once studied with Socrates. Under his rule, roughly 1 in 20 Athenians was killed or exiled within 13 months. Even Socrates was ordered, along with 4 other citizens, to arrest an innocent man named Leon of Salamis so the regime could seize his property. Socrates simply refused and went home, risking execution for defying the 30. The other 4 obeyed. Leon was killed anyway. But Socrates had made his principles unmistakably clear. According to later accounts, the wealthy young Alcibiades even tried, more than once, to draw closer to Socrates through flattery and personal charm, hoping to gain some special advantage from the association. Socrates, famously indifferent to wealth, beauty, and status, never took the bait, which reportedly baffled Alcibiades more than almost anything else in his life. Under the rule of the 30, ordinary Athenians lived in real terror. Property could be seized on a whim, political rivals executed without trial, and entire families exiled overnight. For 13 months, a man who had once sat and debated ethics with Socrates now ruled the city through fear alone. In 403 BC, exiled Democrats fought their way back into the city and overthrew the 30 tyrants. Critias himself was killed in the fighting. Democracy returned to Athens, but the city carried fresh, painful memories of exactly how fragile that democracy had proven to be. Years later, an Athenian general who fought beside him that day would praise his composure specifically, saying that any enemy who attacked a retreating man walking with that kind of calm, alert confidence would think twice before trying it. Comedy and contempt. Years before any of that political violence, Socrates had already become a household name in Athens, thanks to comedy, not philosophy. In 423 BC, the popular playwright Aristophanes staged a satire called The Clouds. Featuring a wild caricature of Socrates as the head of a school he mockingly called the Thinkery. On stage, this fictional Socrates floated above the ground in a basket to think more clearly, worshipped clouds instead of the traditional gods, and taught wealthy young men how to twist any argument, honest or dishonest, into a winning one. The real Socrates, famously, sat in the audience and laughed along. But comedy has a long memory, and Athens kept restaging the play for years afterward. Long after the joke was told, many ordinary Athenians who never once spoke to Socrates only knew him as that strange man from the play, the one who denied the gods and taught people to argue their way out of anything. That caricature mattered more than it should have. 2 decades later, when real legal charges were finally brought against him, Socrates himself would point out in his own defense that the play had already convicted him in the public imagination, long before any formal court ever did. By 403 BC, democracy had been restored after the fall of the 30 tyrants, and Athens declared a general amnesty, a legal agreement, not to prosecute people for what they did during the civil strife. That meant Nobody could formally charge Socrates simply for having taught Critias or Alcibiades. But the resentment never actually went away. Strangely enough, Socrates and Aristophanes were, by most accounts, genuinely friendly outside the theater. Years later, Plato would even write the two of them sharing food, wine, and warm conversation together at a dinner party. The satire, it seems, was never entirely personal. But most Athenians in the audience never learned that part of the story. Around the same period, Athens grew increasingly suspicious of intellectuals in general. A respected natural philosopher had earlier been prosecuted and exiled from the city for suggesting the sun was simply a glowing rock, not a god. To many ordinary citizens, bold new ideas about the world had started to feel like a genuine threat to the old order. The Indictment. In 399 BC, a young poet named Meletus walked to the office of the city's chief magistrate and formally swore out a legal indictment against Socrates. The charge? Impiety, meaning disrespect toward the city's gods and corrupting the youth of Athens. If convicted, the penalty could be death. Meletus rarely acted alone. He was quickly joined by two more prominent men. Anytus, a wealthy tanner who had become a leading pro-democracy politician, and Lycon, a skilled public orator. Historians have long suspected that Anytus was the real force behind the prosecution. Anytus had personal reasons to resent Socrates. Ancient sources say his own son had spent time listening to Socrates instead of following his father into the family leather trade, and Anytus was furious about it. More broadly, as a democratic leader, he distrusted a man whose questioning style seemed to mock the very idea of majority rule. Under Athenian law, the specific wording of the impiety charge accused Socrates of not believing in the gods the city believed in, and of introducing new, unfamiliar divine beings of his own. That second part likely referred to something Socrates spoke about constantly, an inner voice, a private divine sign that he said warned him whenever he was about to do something wrong. The trial was scheduled quickly. Under Athenian law, a jury this large, 501 ordinary male citizens chosen by lottery, would hear both sides argue their case in a single day, then vote almost immediately. There would be no appeal. Under Athenian law, formal charges like these had to be posted publicly before the trial, giving any citizen the chance to see exactly what Socrates stood accused of. It also meant that, for weeks before the trial even began, all of Athens was talking about the case. Lycon's exact motives remain the least documented of the three accusers, though ancient sources link him to the losses Athens suffered during the war, including the death of his own son. Whatever his personal reasons, his skilled rhetoric added real weight to the prosecution's case. When word of the indictment reached Socrates, friends later said he barely reacted. He kept teaching in the agora exactly as he always had, telling anyone who asked that a man who had done nothing wrong had, in his view, nothing to fear from an honest trial. The trial. On the day of the trial, Socrates, now 70 years old, stood before the assembled jury with no lawyer. Athenian custom expected defendants to speak for themselves. He had, by his own telling, never set foot in a courtroom before in his life. Meletus spoke first, formally reading the charges and arguing that Socrates corrupted young Athenians and disrespected the city's gods. Socrates, according to later accounts, questioned him directly in front of the jury and got Meletus to contradict his own accusation, at one point suggesting Socrates was both an atheist and a believer in strange new gods at the same time. When it was his turn to speak, Socrates refused to grovel. He did not weep, and he pointedly refused to bring his wife and young children into court to beg for pity, a common and expected tactic at the time. Instead, he compared himself to a gadfly, a stinging fly sent by the gods to keep a lazy, drowsy city like Athens awake and honest. He told the jury that a life spent never questioning one's own beliefs was not worth living. He said he would rather die than stop practicing philosophy in the streets of Athens, even if the court ordered him to be silent. It was, by any measure, an unusual legal defense. Then came the vote. Each of the 501 jurors dropped a small bronze disc into one of two urns, one for guilty, one for innocent. According to Plato, the margin was narrow. If just 30 votes had gone the other way, Socrates would have walked free. He was found guilty by roughly 280 votes to 221. Under Athenian law, the trial now moved immediately into a second phase, deciding the punishment. The prosecution proposed the maximum penalty allowed by law, death. Athenian custom then gave the defendant the chance to propose an alternative punishment of his own, and juries usually chose whichever of the two options seemed more reasonable. Socrates, characteristically, refused to play along. He first suggested, half seriously, that his true punishment should be free meals for life at the city's expense, an honor normally reserved for Olympic champions and war heroes. Only when pressed by supportive friends did he reluctantly propose a modest fine instead. Loyal friends, including Crito and the young Plato, offered to personally guarantee a much larger fine to spare his life. But the jury, many of whom had voted not guilty on the original charge, were angered by what looked like arrogance in the face of the court and voted for death by an even wider margin than the conviction itself. The sentence was hemlock poison, the standard method of execution in Athens for condemned citizens. Socrates received the news with the same calm he had shown all day. He told the jurors who had voted against him that he did not fear death, because no one truly knows whether death is good or bad. The number 501 was not arbitrary. Athenian courts deliberately used large odd-numbered juries specifically to avoid a tie vote, since with an odd number, one side always had to win outright. At one point in his defense, Socrates told the jury bluntly that he believed himself to be, in his own strange way, a gift from the gods to the city of Athens, sent to keep its citizens honest. It was not the kind of statement designed to win over 500 skeptical jurors. Ancient sources differ slightly on the exact vote count, but all agree it was close. A shift of only a few dozen votes out of 501 would have sent Socrates home a free man that same afternoon. Near the end of his defense, Socrates told the jury plainly that he would rather die having spoken honestly in his own manner than beg for his life and live by pretending to be someone he wasn't. Whatever else historians debate about this trial, few doubt that he meant every word of it. 30 days, the cell. But the execution could not happen immediately. Athenian religious law forbade executions while a sacred ship was away on its yearly pilgrimage to the island of Delos, honoring an ancient vow. That ship had left the harbor the day before the verdict. Socrates would spend nearly a month more alive waiting in prison. He spent that month exactly as he had spent every other month of his adult life, talking with visitors about philosophy. Friends and students came daily to the prison, and by every account, Socrates showed no fear, no despair, and remarkably good humor. Early one morning, his old friend Crito arrived before dawn, having already bribed the guard to let him in. He had arranged everything: a route out of the city, safe passage to a friendly region called Thessaly, and enough money to live out his days in comfortable exile. All Socrates had to do was agree. Socrates refused. He argued that he had lived his entire 70 years in Athens, benefiting from its laws, its protection, and its institutions, and had never once left to live under different laws elsewhere. By staying, he said, he had effectively agreed to abide by the city's judgments, even the ones he believed were wrong. To flee now, breaking the law simply because the verdict was unfair to him personally, would mean becoming exactly the kind of person he had spent his whole life arguing against. Someone who does wrong simply because he can get away with it. He would rather die an innocent man wrongly convicted than live as a guilty fugitive who broke his own principles to survive. Word eventually reached the city that the sacred ship had been sighted returning from Delos. Its arrival meant only one thing. The month of waiting was over, and the execution could finally proceed. During his final weeks, Socrates reportedly did something almost nobody expected. He began writing poetry, something he had never done before in his life. He said a recurring dream had long urged him to practice the arts, and facing death, he finally decided it was worth taking the warning seriously. Crito, for his part, never fully stopped worrying. He fretted about what people would say of him for failing to save his old friend, and worried about the cost of the funeral arrangements. Socrates gently teased him for it, telling him not to worry so much about a body that would, in the end, simply be a body. Even his most devoted students struggled with his decision. Plato, still young and clearly shaken, reportedly wanted desperately to argue him out of it. But Socrates held firm, insisting that a philosopher who spent his whole life talking about doing what's right couldn't simply abandon that principle the moment it cost him something. For 30 days, Athens carried on as normal around him. Markets opened, ships came and went, and citizens argued about ordinary matters, largely unaware that inside a small stone room nearby, one of the most consequential conversations in the city's history was quietly still taking place. The last day. On his final morning, Socrates' closest friends and students gathered in his cell before sunrise, Crito having again arranged early entry with the guard. Among them was young Apollodorus, known even among his friends for how openly and easily he wept. His wife Xanthippe was there too, holding their youngest child, and she wept openly at the sight of the gathered friends. Socrates, ever composed, asked that she be gently taken home, saying he preferred to spend his final hours in calm conversation rather than in mourning. For most of that final day, by later accounts, Socrates did what he always did. He talked philosophy. The conversation turned to the nature of the soul, and whether death was truly an ending or simply a passage into something else. He seemed, his students later wrote, entirely at peace with the question. Plato himself, by his own account, was not in the room that day, kept away by illness. What we know of these final hours comes largely from the memories of the friends who were there, later gathered and written down by Plato as a tribute to his teacher. As the sun began to lower, the jailer entered, and, with evident reluctance, informed Socrates it was time. In accordance with the court's sentence, he would drink a preparation of poisoned hemlock himself, rather than face any more violent method of execution. Socrates asked simple, practical questions about the correct procedure, then, according to Plato's account, drank the cup without hesitation, without complaint, and without any visible fear. He is remembered as having remained composed and even gently reassuring toward the friends whose grief he could see growing around him. He was told to walk slowly until his legs grew heavy, then to lie down. As numbness quietly spread through his body, he remained calm and spoke gently with the friends beside him. Near the very end, tradition holds, he uncovered his face just long enough to remind Crito of one small unpaid debt, a minor ritual offering, and then said nothing more. Among the visitors that final day were two young philosophers from the city of Thebes who pressed Socrates with pointed, difficult questions about whether the soul truly survives the body at all. Socrates welcomed the challenge warmly, later friends recalled, treating it as exactly the kind of honest argument he had always hoped for. The jailer who brought the poison was, by tradition, deeply affected by the moment. He reportedly told Socrates, with tears in his eyes, that of all the condemned men he had ever served in that cell, none had faced their final hours with such calm, good-natured courage. Scholars still debate the exact meaning of those final words about a small ode offering. Some read it simply as an ordinary household debt, left unsettled in the rush of his final month. Others see something deeper, a quiet suggestion that death itself might be less an ending than a kind of release or even a cure. Legacy. Socrates left behind no books, no essays, no written philosophy of his own. Everything we know about him comes from the people who loved and remembered him. Above all, his student Plato, who spent decades afterward writing dialogues that placed Socrates at their center. Plato went on to found a school just outside Athens, known as the Academy, widely considered the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. There, generations of students, including a young man named Aristotle, studied logic, ethics, and natural philosophy, carrying Socratic questioning forward into new directions entirely. Modern historians still debate exactly why Athens executed him. Some point to the lingering trauma of the war and the brutal rule of the 30 tyrants, a democracy desperate to feel secure again after unimaginable loss. Others point simply to old grudges, powerful men who never forgave being publicly out-argued by a barefoot stonemason's son. What almost everyone agrees on is the result. Rather than silencing Socrates, his execution turned him into philosophy's first martyr, a permanent symbol of the tension between free inquiry and the fear it can provoke in the people holding power. Every philosophy student who has ever been taught to question their own assumptions, every classroom exercise built around asking why instead of simply accepting an answer, traces its lineage back to one barefoot man who annoyed the most powerful people in his city until they decided they had heard enough. Socrates once said that the unexamined life is not worth living. 24 centuries later, the city that killed him for asking questions is remembered largely because he asked them. And the questions, it turns out, never really stopped. In the years just after the execution, later, admittedly embellished traditions claim that many Athenians came to regret the verdict, and that the 3 accusers themselves fell out of public favor. Whether or not every detail of that regret is strictly accurate, the trial's reputation as a civic mistake only grew with time. Today, the Socratic method is taught in law schools, philosophy departments, and classrooms across the world, built entirely on the same simple habit that got Socrates killed, asking patient, persistent questions instead of accepting the first confident answer you're given. Another student, a soldier and writer, was away leading a famous mercenary expedition through Persia at the time of the trial. When he returned home and learned what had happened, he wrote his own detailed memories of Socrates, giving history a second independent account of the man beyond Plato's. Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. And Aristotle went on to tutor a young prince who would one day conquer most of the known world. Few death sentences in history have echoed quite so far.